Hello and good morning friends, welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, as you know that from time to time we talk on different topics, different subjects, so that it becomes easier for you to get in-depth knowledge on those subjects, those topics. Dear friends, in this session today we are going to talk on a very interesting topic, and the topic is Metaphysical Poets John Donne. And for this discussion on John Donne, today we have again with us in our studios Professor Anand Prakash. Professor Prakash is a retired professor from Delhi University, and dear friends, as you know that from time to time he visits our studio, and through this EduSet platform he shares maximum knowledge, he shares his experience with you so that you become aware even with the smallest and the tiniest thing in the field of literature. And dear friends, I would like to tell you all that today's session is going to be very interesting from the point of view that we have again with us in our studios Dr. Urvashi Kohad. Dr. Urvashi Kohad is assistant professor in Department of English, Ram Lal Anand College, where she would be accompanying Professor Anand Prakash. They two would be having a very vivacious discussion, I would say, over here, through which you would be getting maximum. So without wasting any time, I would like to welcome our guest Professor Anand Prakash, as well as I would like to welcome Dr. Urvashi Kohad. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you, Gidika, for your kind words again, and welcome viewers. Today's topic, as has been announced, is Metaphysical Poets John Donne. And since most of the time we have discussed Shakespeare or the early modern writers, and in another instance of series we also discussed literary theory. So this particular century, which is the 17th century, to which the metaphysical poets belong, has remained slightly out of focus. So one thought, that if some important writers apart from Shakespeare are taken up from the 17th century, then there will be some higher kind of an awareness of the reality that unfolded itself in the 17th century. John Donne in particular belongs to the early part of the 17th century, but there are certain features common to all the metaphysical poets which are crystallized also in John Donne, who is the father of metaphysical poetry. But before I begin discussing John Donne, I would like to draw your attention to what is called the metaphysical in English poetry. The word is very strange, it's very weird, it has lots of meanings. In fact, there is a branch in philosophy which is called metaphysics, and metaphysics means that which is beyond physics, beyond reality, beyond the parameters of the universe, beyond the parameters of the earth. When something which is not a part of the physical reality, the palpable reality, the reality that we face on a daily basis, the reality of food, the reality of shelter, the reality of clothing, the reality of protection, the reality of education, all these things are a part of physical reality. But if somebody leaves this reality, says a goodbye to this reality, and starts soaring, flying, in a realm which is not easily known and which is sometimes unknowable, then it becomes metaphysical. So metaphysical in the 17th century and also for another couple of centuries remained a pejorative term. It was a critical term. It was a term that was supposed to help us laugh at the poetry that was written by metaphysical poets, so called, in the early 17th century. And since it was a pejorative term, so this poetry was not taken seriously at all till about 100 years later, when people started discussing these poets from a different point of view. Now, one reason why metaphysical poetry is treated with this kind of sense of laughter, if not satire actually, then the reason would be that poetry was not available to the larger mass of readers till that time. I don't think any poem of John Donne would have been published by the time he in fact breathed his last. And after his death in 1633 and 1635, the first collection of his poems saw the print and was available for the readers in black and white. So how did John Donne then approach his readers, if not through the printed word. And he would write a poem, or he might get his poetry written later by another person, and the versions, the manuscripts of the poems, they would circulate by hand. So it goes from one person to another. People read it. Sometimes they read it in a group of 2 or 3. They get back to the poet, and this is how people were entertained. So this was the origin of, let's say, writing of poetry in the 17th century. Before that, we've had poets, as I in the earlier lectures and discussions have pointed out. We had poets like Chaucer in as early as the 14th century, then Spenser and Wyatt and Surrey and all other poets. But then the way the metaphysical poets in the 17th century took their particular profession of writing poetry, that was remarkably distinct. And for this reason, some kind of an understanding of what metaphysical stands for is important. So I have in fact drawn a list of certain words, which tell us about the essence, the nature, the character of what can be called metaphysical poetry. For instance, metaphysical poetry in general, and as it is understood by readers and critics, is supposed to be unfamiliar and unusual. People don't associate this kind of a writing with literature. Literature, follows certain conventions, and if somebody doesn't follow those conventions and still wants to write poetry, then people will find such a thing very strange. So it's unfamiliar. Nobody has written like this before John Donne and his associates, who will emerge later, and it is unusual. So unfamiliar because you have not come across any such thing, and unusual because it's beyond expectations. One doesn't know what poetry is and how they are writing, and how this kind of a writing will benefit the reader. So this is the question that metaphysical poetry raises on its own. It tells people that it tries to wake up people from some kind of an intellectual slumber. People have been asleep. They have been taking things for granted. Well, today it is like this, tomorrow is going to be the same, and day after tomorrow also will repeat whatever happened today and tomorrow. So that way things are usual. But when somebody says something out of the usual, makes it unusual, then people sit up, they wake up, and then they start listening with that kind of curiosity, which is important for the appreciation of literature. And therefore these two words are important, that metaphysical poetry is unfamiliar, unlike anything that is come across, and it is unusual. You don't generally hear these words in that kind of a combination, where either they mean nothing at all, or if they mean something, then that meaning is once again out of the way, out of approach of the common reader. Out of the ordinary is another word that comes in connection with this word, out of the ordinary. So ordinary is the mundane, ordinary is the daily routine. And if something extraordinary, out of the ordinary happens, for instance, there is a day when there is darkness in the afternoon and nobody can see anything, that's out of the ordinary. So maybe there is an eclipse. But before eclipses, were studied and explained in terms of reference to the location of stars and planets, before that, if there was an eclipse in the afternoon or in the forenoon or at noontime, then people would straight away say, well, gods are angry with us and they have snatched light from us. So this kind of a thing, that the out of the ordinary drew that kind of an interest, attention, and created a sense of fear. So this poetry, which is supposed to be the poetry in the conventions of English poetry, this poetry is out of the ordinary. Poets don't talk like that. Poets make sense. Poets follow certain rules of morality. Poets follow certain rules to guide us along lines of the moral path. If that doesn't happen, then the poem is out of the ordinary. Then it is strange, weird, unacceptable, because the metaphysical poets will say certain things which are not accepted as normal, as pro-human, as acceptable. So somebody might think of an abuse. Now abuse is not poetry at all. So somebody might say that some details about physical intimacy between a man and a woman is unusual. So that's not accepted by the civilized society. So if it is unacceptable, If it is weird, if it is strange, then it will be clubbed with the term metaphysical. The other meaning of metaphysical would be non-material. Non-material, which can't be made sense of, which can't be touched, which is not available to our perceptions, to our senses, and it is not material, actual, real. So we are in a way moving around in a kind of make-believe, in a magical world where nothing is real. And if literature is not real, if literature doesn't refer to our emotions and feelings, if literature does not make us look inwards to understand the actions and the sensations that go on in us, then literature is found to be of limited use. But then, if it is non-material, then perhaps some people will say that while reading this kind of literature, we are wasting our time. But it is non-material. It doesn't refer to the place. It doesn't refer to the town where we live, for instance. It doesn't refer to the political developments that happen in our time. It doesn't refer to the wars. It doesn't refer to the need and necessity of peace. And well, in that sense, it doesn't relate to us. So that is non-material. Illusory, the same thing. That you sit down, you relax, you close your eyes, and you think that the world has gone, totally changed, and it looks like paradise, and you are dreaming about it, and you live in that state of dreaming, for some time. But finally, when you wake up, you open your eyes, I realize, for instance, that it was an illusion. I just made it myself with my own imagination, and that nothing happened around me. Nobody, in fact, knew that I was undergoing this kind of experience. So this is illusory. So is metaphysical illusory? Is the question, and this question has been, in fact, discussed by readers in different points of time.
Sir, sorry to interrupt you, but before we go further, probably an idea that I wanted to share is you talk about him trying to wake people up from their intellectual slumber, and also the kind of metaphysical poetry is that which is at times could be strange, could be weird, could be unacceptable, out of the ordinary. And can we then say that his poetry was specifically meant for the people amongst whom it was circulated, the coterie readership? And of course, it was meant to in some way also offend them. That is probably what John Donne wanted, or for them to accept an idea which was probably not being told to them through any other way. And you also mentioned, sir, that his poems were not, John Donne's poems were not available until he died in 1635. So, and that is the reason why the poems are so pleasurable for the ordinary readers as against the coterie readership, because it was meant for somebody else, and then the others can just take pleasure in reading his poems.
Mm-hmm. I think that is exactly what I am saying, and it was a kind of poetry which was shared by a limited number of people, and all of them belonged to the upper class at that time. Those who could read and write, those who could mix up like this, those who could discuss, the problems that life faced at that time. But then, the same people who are discussing these things are in fact showing up a tendency.
Okay.
They live a life. They have certain offices. They have certain duties to perform. And when they relax, then somebody sits down and writes about one's concerns. Now, the way one writes, that way is not usual. That is not conventional. He or she, there's no point of she here, because all the poets are men. So this person looks around, doesn't find anything interesting. So he, out of his imagination, he creates something which will appeal to a coterie, as you say. And well, after that, the poem will be kept in a corner, and one will forget about it. So it will not be discussed in the way in which Shakespeare's plays at the same time will be discussed. So that is what made these things metaphysical. And the term metaphysical was used by those who didn't like this kind of poetry, who found this poetry unapproachable, or who found this poetry less of use, not of use, not of common significance. So that is what was initially supposed to be metaphysical. Well, this person lives somewhere else. He lives, in a land of imagination where nobody else can easily enter. So this person will offer us a peep into that world. But that world is an imaginary world. It's unreal. Therefore, one should not waste time. So that is what is said about this, and there is a lot of prejudice in this description of the poetic trend that we are discussing. But then it was only later, much later in fact, maybe in the 20th century, when people realized that these people, these poets were not merely talking sense, but they were reflecting a kind of a trend in history which was lost for all time to come as soon as these people stopped writing in the 17th century. So it's a very interesting area. Now it's a major field, and we will maybe to some extent discuss this trend. But then, as you rightly said, that the poems of these writers were confined to a limited number of people, and these people were all literarily, philosophically, ideologically, politically equipped. And so they wrote for enjoyment, they wrote for teasing one another. And when you tease somebody intellectually, then of course you are raising lots of questions regarding existence, regarding philosophy, regarding in fact God, regarding religion. And I'll come to this maybe a little later. But then at the moment, I'm grappling with the word metaphysical that is used to describe them. Now, I'll say two more things minor things about the same prejudice with which this trend was viewers associated.
Sir, can we say this trend was revolutionary in nature, not to the extent that it may have been seen then, but perhaps now as we can perceive the ideas that were conveyed by John Donne, and the tone also used.
Yes. No, I'll use the word revolutionary in the literal sense. Revolution in the literal sense means that there's a wheel and it's revolving. And each revolution of the wheel takes things from one position to another. So what is at the top, in the middle of the revolution, it becomes bottom. And later on it comes back to the top. That is what revolution is. So if we take this word literally, then of course whatever was supposed to be significant by the larger mass of people, by the larger number of writers, that was questioned here as insignificant. So significant is its opposite. Bottom is its opposite. That is the upper level. So yes, there was a kind of revolutionary tinge to this kind of expression, because they were questioning the established parameters of thought, the established parameters of feeling. So if love was supposed to be a romantic thing, the person is pining for a woman who will never be his, and then this person would enjoy waiting for her and die unfulfilled in his life. Then this will be a subject of poetry of a large number of medieval poets who would always think of the beloved who will be impossible to reach. But then these poets are writing about love in such a manner as if the woman is just standing in front of them, and they are having a good look at her, and then they are talking in terms that are highly different and unusual for the time. So there is a kind of feeling that is being conveyed through this poetry, which unsettles the established thought, the established conventions. And for this reason, as you pointed out, it is revolutionary. It's going to inspire, let's say, in the coming centuries, writers to take courage in both their hands and to experiment with literature of a different kind. In the 20th century, for instance, when people unearthed the hidden meanings of this poetry, then a kind of change in sensibility occurred. So the 20th century realized that in the 17th century something must be happening, which was inciting these writers to come forward with a different set of preferences in literature. So you're right in saying this, that they were questioning all the rooted conventions, and they were saying things which would tell the people to disrespect, reject, and completely take leave of the conventional at that point of time. So no logic per se is also followed in this poetry. You can't connect one with another. There is a kind of connection between one thing and another. If there is a school, then there are students. If there are students, there are books. If there are books, there is knowledge. All these things, are logically connected. But in the case of metaphysical poetry, what happens is that things are not logically connected. For instance, in one of the poems, John Donne says, busy old fool. And well, I started thinking that he's talking about a person who's standing in front of him. And the next line is unruly sun. So he's looking upwards and talking to the sun, and he's calling him busy old fool. And then, when one starts saying, what is the logic behind this? How can the sun be taken as a human being who is busy and who is foolish? And then, of course, when the meaning becomes clear, that the sun is all the time active, all the time moving around the earth. Of course, I don't want to go into the psychological, the scientific argument that it's not the revolution of the earth, of the sun around the earth, but the other way around. But then he's looking at the sun and realizes that the sun is wasting his time all the while, and he's busy and he's foolish. So this kind of a logic, it lays bare certain other aspects of reality which only people like John Donne and his friends would make sense of. So there is less of logic, and in fact it is not only illogical, it is also non-logical. Illogical, and there is a certain shade of difference between the two. Illogical is it doesn't make sense, and non-logic is that it doesn't follow any logic, and outside the logic there is something that would be available to us. So it's both illogical and non-logical. Logical has been completely shunted out of the parameters of discussion, so far as this particular way of looking at things is concerned. Now, I have our friends put most of the words together that explain the negative side of metaphysical poetry. It's non-material, it doesn't make sense, it's not logical, all those things. So there's a whole list that I've given, and now I'm giving another set of words in order to explain. And yet, so now the category of yet starts, that it's still useful for us, valuable for us, and it sheds light on what we confront and what we deal with. For instance, it is interesting, so it doesn't bore you. When you read this poetry, then you feel dazzled, you feel fascinated, you want to ask questions. It is interesting, it is engaging, it takes you into a certain area which you might have visited sometimes in your imagination, but then came out of it thinking that you're wasting your time, I was wasting my time. But then for some time you would like to say, okay, let me waste my time, let me think about this question that these people have raised, and maybe that there is some sense hidden in it, and so you start engaging with it. Finally, if you engage with it and do not find any meaning in it, then you think it's a challenge. So you'll have to find out why this man said this. Now this is interesting because John Donne is not an ordinary person. He's a seer, he's a philosopher, he's a thinker, he's a person with very intense feelings. And if he's saying these illogical things, then I have to find out, as a seeker of knowledge, I have to find out exactly what he means. So readers also take it as a challenge, and when you take it as a challenge, then you start being active in the world of literature and in the world of thought in a manner which is unprecedented. So that is what is good about this poetry. You read a poem, you don't understand it, but you know that there is something serious being said, so you go back to it again. Maybe you give a third reading to it, and then maybe you refer to certain words which were current at that time, and they have been mentioned or they have been brought in, and you would like to know more about them. So you take it as a challenge, and when you take it as a challenge, you very much become a part of metaphysical poetry in its written and in its suggestive form. So it's a challenging thing, which is good for the study and the enjoyment of literature. It is contradictory and self-contradictory. And if it is contradictory, then once again it doesn't follow any logic, but then it puts two words together, and the words deny each other the possibility of engagement. So it contradicts itself. But viewers, don't you think that you sometimes also contradict? I also contradict myself, and I know why I am doing it. Maybe there are certain situations in which being logical is dangerous. So I stop in the middle and I start saying the opposite. And somebody says, you already contradicted yourself. Well, I know within my own self, that I contradicted because there was a pressure. So people are sometimes compelled to lie also. They are compelled to go against their own wishes also, just for the sake of keeping themselves safe. So contradiction is a part of life. There is a poor man and he is angry, and there is a rich man who has lots of protectors with him, bouncers, let's call them in today's language. So the poor man would not like to express himself even though he is angry. So there is a kind of a contradiction. The anger is to be expressed, but the person is smiling. So it means that there is a kind of contradiction built in the situation that we find ourselves in. So contradiction is there in life, and sometimes contradiction is there in language, and most people can't articulate themselves properly, therefore they contradict themselves. So, and this poetry captures contradiction in its essential form. It is contradictory and it is self-contradictory. Sometimes it contradicts others, sometimes I contradict myself. I go against my own established preferences. Then I use another word, and that word is very positive these days. That word defines all literature in general and poetry in particular, and that word is paradox. Paradox means that there are two opposite words, they apparently are opposite, but you put them together and they start making sense. Life is good because if it is good, it will make you fight against those things in life which are bad. Suppose I say this, that life is good because it gives you an opportunity to fight something which is bad. So there is a kind of paradox, that it's good and it's fighting against bad. And of course I'm making sense because this is absolutely true. So in poetry you will find paradoxes all the time, and in good poetry still more, because it's very difficult to define what is good, what is bad, what is useful, what is valuable. It is very difficult to define, and if you define, then you have to keep in touch with both aspects of the reality. In fact, both aspects of the reality are joined in the reality itself. Aspects are two, but the thing is one. Now see the paradox in this. So poetry deals with the paradox in life, and the poet, a metaphysical poet, uses this paradox to the hilt. Without this paradox, poet cannot write, and this is particularly true of the metaphysical poet. Then the other word is wit. Paradox is very close to wit. When you are using wit, then you are suggesting 2 or 3 other dimensions also. So you say something, people start laughing, you said it seriously, which means that there is something witty inbuilt in your saying, in your statement, and that witty part starts attracting people more than the serious part that one wants to bring one's attention to. So wit, paradox, these are the words that are particularly relevant to the discussion of metaphysical poetry, and that I can say this in this form also, that the imagined and the real together in a meaningful combination. The combination is meaningful, but the real and unreal are both there in the combination. This is what metaphysical poetry may be. And then I come out of the discussion about the word metaphysical, and I say that Elizabethan period and the Jacobean period. Elizabethan period is the second half of the 16th century, and the Jacobean period is between 1603 when King James assumed the throne, and it goes up to, let's say, 1630 or so, around the time John Donne would die. So this is the Jacobean period, and these periods were actually they were marked by some kind of a change. There was a kind of transition happening from the old medieval world to the modern world. Before Elizabeth, England was one kind of a country. It was not as important maybe before, let's say in the 15th century. In the 16th century, it emerged as a strong country, and many upheavals happened in the 16th century. And Shakespeare has been witness to this in his own time, which starts from 1670 or so. He was born in 1664. From that time onwards, and therefore drama all of a sudden as a form in literature emerged. Shakespeare's drama actually is the beginning of English drama. There are a few dramatists who are before Shakespeare, but this drama flowers in English literature around 1690. And that why is drama at that time coming up? The reason is that England is changing in such a manner from the old to the new world that the reality of it can be captured only through drama, only through the dialogue, only through different positions that the characters take on the stage, where the ending is not at all a very natural outcome of the beginning in the play. The play starts and people are enjoying the scenes, and suddenly things hot up, and it ends on some note of curiosity, some note of query, or sometimes a note of destruction and death. This is what. So when things are changing so fast that from the beginning to the end the whole thing is completely upturned, this is what the English reality is, and this reality requires a different form of poetry, and that poetry in its new form required once again certain other kind of styles and voices, and maybe the metaphysical poets who are able to provide that kind of a voice to the reality of the time. I will not take it up because that's not the topic. We have to very soon come to John Donne as a poet. So I will just finish this by saying that the first part of the discussion, that in the beginning of the onset of metaphysical poetry, it received a very hostile reaction from people. It was that reaction was negative, it was critical, and this continued in the particular in the 18th century, 19th century, when justice was not done to metaphysical poetry. The person who popularized this term metaphysical was Dr. Johnson, Samuel Johnson, in the 18th century, but he was a great critic. He also knew, that there was something that the metaphysical poets were saying. Therefore, he wrote extensively on one or two poets, and he was using very strange words to explain the implications of the word metaphysical. And I'll just use certain words that he brought in. He said that contraries means opposites. Contraries are brought together violently. So there are two things, two extremes, and if you put the two extremes together and they are going against each other, and if you do violence in language and through that violent language you put them together, then it becomes metaphysical. That's the kind of description that Johnson gave to it. And of course, in the 20th century, as I already referred, there were writers. There was a critic called Grierson. There was another called Helen Gardner, and these people dug out the poems of metaphysical poets, and they brought out editions. They went into a kind of research, and that research showed that those people were properly addressing the issues and the complexities of the time in the Jacobean period.
Sir, was Samuel Johnson sympathetic? I'm not sure if I can use that term, but did he credit the poetry of the metaphysical poets, considering that he popularized the term? So this would show his interest in the kind of poetry that was written by metaphysical poets, and he wanted to bring it to the fore and introduce it to other people as well. But considering the statement where he says contraries are brought together violently, it shows his condescending attitude towards the poetry, saying he's trying to reject it in some way.
He was not popularizing it, he was talking about it, and as you said in the second part, he was in fact attacking it. He was telling people to shun this kind of poetry, because there is violence in poetry. There is supposed to be harmony, there is supposed to be sweetness, there is supposed to be smooth coexistence. But if the smooth coexistence is replaced by a very harsh kind of a selection of words, very violently yoked. Actually, the word he uses, the contrary is violently yoked together. So when there are two oxen and they are put yoked together so that they have to go in one direction, and one ox takes one direction, the other ox takes another direction. That's the metaphor. So you are right that Johnson was not sympathetic with metaphysical poetry. He was attacking it at that point of time. But even while attacking, as you pointed out, he was giving time to it. He was giving attention to it, and he was grappling to understand its reality, even though negatively, but he was grappling with it. And therefore people started talking about it, and then as time went on, in the 19th century very few would talk about metaphysical poets, but then in the 20th century, when contraries in history also emerged, in the early part of the 20th century, you have these contraries of capitalism and socialism. Now nothing could be more contrary of these two terms. They don't generally come together, and in the first 25-30 years of the 20th century, people start thinking of these contraries in terms in which the metaphysical also understood. So if the contraries are very intense at one point of time, then you start looking backwards into history, and there you realize that such a situation existed. So one more last point, now that you raised the question, T.S. Eliot was the one who, using Johnson and his own understanding of literature, he said that metaphysicals were the last ones to keep the sensibility together, sensibility of the time, composite, and later on it became a dissociation of sensibility. That's the phrase that Eliot is very good at, phrasing things, and he calls it, a dissociation of sensibility.
Yes.
After that, English sensibility will go in two different directions. There will be a severe, parting of, let's say, the emotion and the reason part. Reason will go one way, emotion will go another. And Eliot will indirectly refer to the Romantics in the early 19th century, who only focused upon emotion and kept the reason out of bounds for them. So, dissociation of sensibility, according to T.S. Eliot, occurred in the immediately after the metaphysical poets. They were the last ones, who kept ideas and feelings together. And it's a major argument in the 20th century that after that the world will split into two parts. The world will not be integrated. So they are trying to achieve the two things integrated, who are otherwise opposites, which are otherwise opposites, and these are the metaphysical poets. So the 20th century is the century in which metaphysical poetry has been pedestalized, so to say, and now there are studies in English which say that this kind of a contraries, idea of the contraries, is common not merely to different metaphysical poets, but also common with the other writers. For instance, Shakespeare, who is a dramatist. Now, many of the expressions in Shakespeare would be very close to the kind of writing that one sees in the metaphysical poetry. So, viewers, from here we take the direction. We assume the direction of John Donne, the writer, and let me tell a few things about John Donne. John Donne, birth is in the same decade in which Shakespeare is born. Both are born in the 1560s. Now there are, I was looking up the dates, and again there are certain dates in the histories of literature and in the discussions of English writers, and John Donne is supposed to have been born in 1572. Some books say that he was born in 1568. Some would say that he was born in 1566, and I was measuring the period with reference to Shakespeare, who is born in 1564. So he is younger by 4 years, 6 years, or 8 years, something like this. But then the point that I am making is that he is a contemporary of Shakespeare. He is also a contemporary of Ben Jonson, who is born in 1572. So the years are very, very, in fact, in one history, the year is the same. So Ben Jonson and John Donne are born in the same year. Then you have Francis Bacon, who is born in 1561. So in a span of 10 or 11 years, these 3 or 4 people are born. Now, have a look at the 3 or 4 people that I have mentioned: Shakespeare, Ben Jonson, Francis Bacon, John Donne. All of them are born in the same decade, which means that they are spectators. They are onlookers of the scene of England in the second half of the 16th century together. And if John Donne is writing this way, then he's sharing his sensibility with others who are born at the same time and who are also confronting the same situation. So if you find difficulties in Shakespeare, if you find difficulties in Francis Bacon in his ideas, for instance his idea of logic, Bacon's logic, I discussed this in my literary theory questions. His idea of logic is entirely different from the established logic, and in fact he talked of the inductive logic at that time, and you will find that maybe John Donne can be looked at from that angle. His poems, that it starts one way and then it naturally moves forward, and in the course of its movement the writer is correcting it. So learning, the pitfalls of the expression in the beginning and then correcting more and more. This is what exactly that Bacon is doing. Ben Jonson, who is writing comedies, and comedies of a different kind than Shakespeare, and whose comedies, bring out the dark aspects, the heavy, the immoral aspects of reality so very sharply that, the kind of references, the kind of suggested or even open abuses that you see in metaphysical poets, those are reflected as clearly in Ben Jonson. So, why are these 3 or 4 people grappling with the reality in more or less the same manner, in an identical manner? The reason is found in history. It is that, the country is moving in a different direction. It's no more going to assign any value to the medieval world, to the medieval order. It will not. It will very soon start criticizing even the king, the upper classes and the king. And metaphysical poetry is an immediate, is a very close precursor to what is going to happen 10 or 15 years later, when English society will not be the same. So this is the kind of ethos in which metaphysical poetry appeared, and one can't separate John Donne or other poets of the category, because they are also a part of the same landscape from where emerged people like Bacon, Shakespeare, and Ben Jonson. Now, to come to the poet that we have in question, let me say that John Donne wrote 3 or 4 kinds of poems in his career. One, he wrote satires, and I already mentioned Ben Jonson, who writes satires regularly. Most of his plays are satirical. They are called comedies of humors. And you have Shakespeare using humor generally, but sometimes it's very satirical. So this person starts with writing satires, and satires in poems, not in plays. So he's treating things with some kind of disdain, some kind of a contempt. He wants to emphasize the moral, and by exposing the immoral, he does so very effectively. This is what we see in his poems. The second category is of elegies, where he gives a different interpretation to elegy. Elegy initially is supposed to be primarily supposed to be condoling the death of, mourning the death of a close friend. But elegy can also have a different form, where through the idea of sadness, a kind of interpretation of the world is given, and elegy can also discuss death in very philosophical terms. So in a way, the scope of elegy is further expanded and compounded by John Donne in his famous elegies. Then the major chunk of his writing is under the category of songs and sonnets. So he bursts into a song, and this song is not the kind of song that medieval writers would be composing, or the later romantics would be writing, but they are nonetheless songs. And when you read these songs, then some kind of similarity is found between his songs and the songs that Shakespeare composed for his plays, and these similarities have been now studied quite well. And lastly, he also has written religious poems. Now, what is religion to do with metaphysical poetry? What is religion to do with the erotic, with the physical, with for instance love, intense love of the body? And sometimes Donne is able to suggest, because of his passion, things in such a manner that when he is talking of death, when he is talking of death of the lovers, which can be very closely connected with the intense physical sexual emotion, and and he brings in then the idea of Christ also. So imagine sex, love, intimacy, blood, death, and Christ. He is able to combine all these things, and he is a very intense love poet and a very intense religious poet. So the kind of intensity that John Donne is able to generate in his poetry, that shows that the person is really bearing the brunt of the difficulties that the times at that time are creating for him, and for people of sensibility, the level that he himself enjoys. So these can be read. You can read, viewers, these poems in light of what I have said. And for instance, these are the poems particularly that take me into the realm of John Donne's poems. Mistress Going to Bed is a poem by him, and the man is watching, the lover is watching the woman going to bed, and he's giving directions to her. And when going to bed means that she is changing clothes. and well, she is shedding clothes one after another, and the man, the viewer, the poet, keeps commenting on a shedding of clothes. In fact, he is waiting that the woman finally becomes naked, and then he can enter the bed, and then he can enjoy her company. Now, this kind of a poem, and it's a longish poem, slightly, it's about 40 lines, and in this poem, he's talking about this part of the attire, then the next attire, and things like this, and finally, he says, okay, now I'll join with you, and the intensity, the kind of impatience with which he is waiting, and he's commenting that shows us even today that this kind of an engagement would not be allowed by the normal civilized people of the time. Lots of hypocrisy would be attached with going to bed with a woman, and even in Christianity, no kind of pleasure is supposed to be taken from being in a love union with a woman, because one is supposed all the time to think of other things than of sex and the bodily pleasure. But then this person is able to combine a different kind of religiosity with love making, and he does it very well, very effectively. I don't say well or not, but very effectively he is able to bring in the question of the man and the woman getting together, and they becoming one in the union, and through that they realize themselves. So what is love? Is it bodily love? He doesn't answer this question very clearly, but then he says that this is an important aspect of love. What is love? That he'll say somewhere else. For instance, there's a poem called Ecstasy, and there's a poem called Platonic Love, where he is saying that love may begin with the physical intimacy, but love is not physical intimacy. And if love is not physical intimacy, and it only begins there, then which direction does love take? Now, it's a philosophical question, it's also a poetic question, and John Donne's answer for this would be that finally love has to be platonic. Love has to be the love of two people at the level of souls, at the level of being together, at the level of being happy, and that happiness is much more when one has left the bodily pleasures behind. And he's making a distinction between the animal kind of the brutish, the savage kind of emotion and expression, and the love which transcends all bounds of the body and attains a different level. So imagine that it's a kind of paradox. You can't have the feeling of love and ecstasy without being physically close, but physical closeness is not love. Love is something different. Now see the paradox. You have to enter the world of love through the body, but after you have done that, then you should leave it behind. If you don't leave it behind, if you don't free yourself from the temptations of the body, from the temptations of lust, then you will all the time remain embroiled in that only, and you will never attain what you would call ecstasy. In another poem, which is slightly more scandalous, is called Autumnal. Now, autumnal is that he's not talking of a woman as a young woman. It's not a woman of 20 or a woman of 30. It's a woman of 60. Perhaps if one goes into the biography of the person, one would say that he had met perhaps the mother of his own friend, and he looked at her and he started praising her in his poem. And in this poem, he says that the woman is 50 or 60, and at that time she looks much more mature. She is much more understanding. And this kind of an understanding and maturity would last for a longer period. A beautiful girl of 15 or so, 16 or 20, that girl would very soon be 40 and 50. But when one is 50, then that 50 can be enlarged to even 65. So there are 15 years of the same kind of situation. So he's in a way examining these areas of the body, of the mind, of stability, and he would say that adult love, the love between a man and a woman of 50 years, is going to be perhaps sounder than the love between a woman and man of 20 years or so. So this poem Autumnal, and that's why he's calling it autumn. Why not winter? Is the question. Why not when a woman is, let's say, 80 years, or man also is 80 or 85 years? He goes into this question, and he says that 80 is actually not going to life at all. It's going to death. And that is, when the man and the woman, they both become useless even as people. So he would not think of love between people who are 80 and more, but he would definitely rate the love between a man and a woman who are 50 higher than when they were 20 or so. And this is a new idea, and you may call it metaphysical if you like, but then I would say it is raising a question where people attain stability after going through all the ups and downs of life. They attain stability and they remain rather relatively fixed at that time and enjoy life much better than before or even after. Then there are poems like Funeral, Apparition, Broken Heart, The Sunrise, the Sun Rising. These are the poems, where he is going into different aspects of love, different aspects of perception also. He is not talking of emotions directly. He is creating a sense of emotion in the middle of a large number of conflicts at the level of language, at the level of symbols, etc. And there, a broken heart, well, why is the heart broken? Because the person is not able to get fulfillment in love, fulfillment in life. But then a broken heart can give you anguish, and that anguish can actually raise the level of consciousness much better than the other smoother kind of experience that one would have undergone. So see, for the metaphysical poet, it's not that it's a life that is hunky-dory, life that is superficially pleasurable. That is important. For a metaphysical poet, life in its most complex forms is important, because that's what life is. It goes through different phases of experience, different phases of the state of mind and body, and all states of mind and body are supposed to be given importance and to be seen for what they are. So this is metaphysical poetry, and if this is metaphysical poetry, then I think it encompasses a larger area of experience than the poetry of romance of young people only would do. So this kind of idea of maturity, this kind of idea of wisdom is in fact inherent in all great literature, and metaphysical poetry, when it takes up the question of maturity at this level, then it becomes a part of great literature without any doubt. Now I'll just end with one or two things. One, that the poetry of metaphysical writers is to be seen as the poetry of, as some people have argued, I was reading one or two books yesterday, is very close to the secular view of life. Even though John Donne in particular was talking about God many a time, and he wrote religious poems, but then the perception is secular, the perception is physical, the perception is historical. He is actually taking up questions of the time. When Roman Catholics are arguing with the Protestants, and Protestants are trying to become more mellow and becoming just Anglican in their thought, it is that which these writers are capturing. And that religion is also taking a new form. Till the 15th century or so, religion would be generally in a hierarchical arrangement, that the upper person, the person who is higher placed, that person will interpret for us the message of God. But in the 16th century onwards, religion became a subject for an individual to discuss, and the individual could discuss religion in one's own way. So this individuality gets reflected in the writing of metaphysical poetry, where religion is being discussed at the level of the individual. And here I would finish by saying that humanist and secular person called John Donne has a famous poem written by him. It's called "No Man is an Island." So viewers, if you have the book, or if you can just Google and find out, read this poem particularly for its very modern interest. It has given this poem particularly has given a great title to Hemingway's novel called "For Whom the Bell Tolls," and the source of this title is in John Donne, and the name of the poem is "No Man is an Island." And what is John Donne is saying? He is saying that if there is one person dies on this planet, then a part of me dies, he says. Which means that all humanity is one. Whether a human being is in America, in India, in China, or wherever, if a single human being dies on a day, a part of me dies. And therefore he says, if the bell is tolling, announcing the death of somebody, don't ask who is dead actually. Who is dead? I am dead. Because my part that was there in that person, that has died at that instance. So I would finish by saying, viewers, that This person is a humanist. He is a great religious thinker. He thinks of God when he thinks of death. And there are poems addressed to God directly also. So which means that he is able to combine God, death, destruction, erotic love, body, all these things in such a manner that it can not be at all metaphysical, it's all very physical. So with this particular, I would like to end here. A great secular humanist who is a person of great imagination. This is what John Donne is for us. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much. From today's session also, we learned the philosophies of life through you by explaining John Donne in detail. And I would like to thank Urvashi Kohad once again for her visit. And we would like to invite her again and again so that we could have a session like these more and more. So dear friends, we would be meeting again tomorrow and would be discussing on one another topic. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.